They sent a convoy that reached Idlib with 2,000 blankets and 300 tons of flour.
There are no problems among the people, but there are political parties, minority parties, which are aggressively against Russian language, and there are small parties which were aggressively for Russian language and sometimes against promotion of Ukrainian.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. We start off with news from Syria. Remarkably, it's good news. In just a month, Palestinians from the West Bank, Israel, and the Gaza Strip raised $10 million for suffering Syrians in Idlib. They sent a convoy that reached Idlib with 2,000 blankets and 300 tons of flour. Hopefully this is the start of something very big and constant. Wondering why the U.S. government, which says it's horrified by what the Russians are doing on the border with Ukraine, aren't doing very much to help Syrians who are being bombarded by Russians every few days. Why not send massive aid, in particular concrete, so people can live in homes instead of tents, and so hospitals can be reinforced from the constant attacks by Russian and Assad bombers. And a bit of good news from Al-Rukban, Syria, on the Jordan-Iraq border. Medical personnel treated people from the camp for the first time in 2 years. The camp is within the security zone of the U.S. Tanf base. Residents have had sit-ins outside the Tanf base, embarrassing the U.S. government, and likely this is the reason why they finally got some medical treatment. We've mentioned the case of Amal Nakhleh, who's been imprisoned by Israel in so-called administrative detention for over a year. Administrative detention means no charges, no trial, and a months-long term that can be renewed indefinitely. DCIP, which stands for Defense of Children International Palestine, writes about another case of Mohammed Mansour. Israeli apartheid authorities have renewed his term for another 4 months. He's 17 years old. He's been held in prison for over 300 days. It should be noted that the Israeli government has branded TCIP as terrorists. They did this last year, along with 5 other prominent Palestinian human rights and civic groups. Ukraine. On February 14th, the international media picked up a story of a grandmother in eastern Ukraine being trained by a Ukrainian soldier in the Special Forces. It was on the front page of the Times of London. Peter Engel reported on it for NBC TV. Nothing wrong with that on the surface, but look closer. The soldier doing the training is wearing a patch. On it is a Wolfsangel. It was worn by a dozen Nazi units during World War II. It's now the emblem of the Azov Battalion, a neo-Nazi unit inside Ukrainian military. I tweeted about this to Richard Engel. Remarkably, he hasn't answered, and the U.S. corporate media hasn't noted it. I wrote this message to our Connecticut senators and followed up with a phone call several days ago. How is it we're giving hundreds of millions of dollars in weapons to a country that has such a unit in its official military? Have you called for the unit to be disbanded and for the neo-Nazi and white nationalist insignias to be banned in the Ukrainian military. It's against U.S. law for U.S. weapons to go to this unit. Is that law enforced? So far, I've received no answer. These are photos from rallies in Ukraine defying Putin's threats on February 12th. Note the large number of Belarusian flags in the crowd. Many refugees from the Belarusian tyrant Lukashenko have fled to the Ukraine. An article I wrote, Protect Ukrainians, Avoid War, was published in the Hearst newspapers of Connecticut. I wrote it on behalf of Promoting Enduring Peace, and they link to it on their site, pepeace.org. Also, check out their growing archive of articles on Ukraine. Now, from an interview with Andrey Kurkov. He's a Ukrainian in Ukraine. He's a prominent writer who wrote the book Ukraine Diary back in 2014. He was interviewed by John Reimann of the site oaklandsocialist.com.
We're talking with Andrey Kurkov, Ukrainian author, and he is in Kiev. How are things in Kiev right now, Andrey?
Well, outside it's quite normal. I mean, no panic. Everybody is walking along the street as usual. Actually, yesterday the cafes were full. I couldn't find a place for 40 minutes with my friends to have lunch. But at the same time, people started talking more about possible war because they were avoiding this topic of conversations. But suddenly, I mean, today I overheard 3 conversations in different places about what people are going to do in case of the Russian aggression. So it does influence the atmosphere, the situation on the border, and the escalation actually of the militant rhetoric on Russian side.
What are your expectations? Do you think that there will be an invasion of some sorts from Russia?
Well, there will be something. I don't know what it will be, because if Putin brought practically different divisions and armies from all around Russia, including border with China, he will not just back down and order them to go back without receiving at least half of what he wants. And so I hope there will be no all-out war, because for that he needs even more soldiers. But local escalation and invasion into one part of the territory is possible.
And you know, you had sent me a note about the oligarchs and so on leaving the country.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Of course, yeah. I mean, on Saturday, the 13th of February, there were more than 20 private jets with oligarchs and rich businessmen leaving the country. And there was a private charter for 50 passengers ordered and paid for by a pro-Russian party, which is called United Party for Life. And just 5 minutes ago, there is a list of members of parliament of Ukraine who left in the recent 2 weeks for abroad, which means that they will not be taking part in the parliamentary sittings, which I think they were moved to tomorrow, the emergency meeting of the parliament. And actually half of the pro-Russian deputies are absent. One of them drove into Belarus. The others flew to Dubai, Doha, Nice, France, Paris, etc.
Is that right? And how about the other? Is it mainly the pro-Russian deputies, or others have left also?
Oh no, also some deputies from Zelensky's party, the servant of the people, they also left.
And what is the general view as far as how Zelensky is handling this crisis?
I don't think there is a general view at all. because I mean, mostly the news is about who among Western leaders is visiting Ukraine, who is going first to Moscow and then to Ukraine, and who is going first to Kiev and then to Moscow, like Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor. I mean, he is today in Kiev and tomorrow is going to Moscow. So, I mean, in all this activity, there is not much thought about role of Zelensky. I mean, he does record videos and addresses to the citizens, asking them not to panic and saying that everything is under control. He was a couple of days ago near Kherson attending the trainings of the National Guard, of the military police on the administrative border with Crimea. So, I mean, he is there, he is present, but I don't think Ukrainians take his role as a very important one. I mean, he's head of the administration, Yermak. I think he's taken more seriously because obviously he is running the office of the president and he is taking a lot of decisions.
And so, are you saying that Zelensky is kind of seen kind of as a football being kicked back and forth by the major powers, or?
No, I wouldn't. I would not say this exactly, but I mean, he didn't make serious geopolitical statements. He was angry with American leaders that they are provoking panic and they are publishing every day the information on the Russian preparedness to attack. He was unhappy with Boris Johnson. I mean, his reactions are not really statesman reactions. I mean, he's worried about possible panic and the effects of this panic on the economy of the country. I mean, if there is a war, there will be no economy.
Right. Now, on a slightly different subject, you know, there's been a lot of talk outside Ukraine in the West about, which I mean west of Ukraine, on the division between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. And you've written that historically there hasn't really been much of a division, or at least that's my understanding of what.
I mean, there is no division on the street. People speak. I mean, many people are bilingual. I mean, there are no problems among the people. But there are political parties, minority parties, which are aggressively against Russian language, and there are small parties which were aggressively for Russian language and sometimes against promotion of Ukrainian. But now it is not an issue. I mean, the law to support the state language was approved by the majority in the parliament. The only state language is Ukrainian. You can buy books in Russian. You can publish books in Russian. My books are published and written in Russian. So if somebody publishes the newspaper in Russian, he should publish also Ukrainian language version according to the new law. So there are new laws, rules, and maybe restrictions. And what is probably very irritative for Putin, for Russia, is that there is no more teaching in the school in Russian language. There are no Russian schools left. All the schools are Ukrainian language schools. But I mean, the children are studying Pushkin and Dostoevsky, and Russian literature is taught as a part of world literature.
But in the past, wasn't it the case that Russian and Ukrainian were more or less equal, and they were both like the official language?
No. The case was that in Kiev, 90% of the schools were Russian schools and 10% were Ukrainian schools. And the parents would send their children, even from Ukrainian families, from Ukrainian-speaking families, to Russian schools because they knew that if you don't speak Russian, you won't make a career, you won't get a good job, you won't be taken seriously.
And how about the situation in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, and especially in the two so-called republics? What's the situation with the languages there?
Well, I mean, Ukrainian language is practically banned in separatist republics, and it doesn't exist anymore in Crimea. All the Ukrainian schools are closed down in Crimea. The Ukrainian language newspapers are closed down. On Ukrainian part of Donbass, the schools are teaching in Ukrainian. People in the streets are speaking both. Mostly they speak Russian, but in Lugansk region, for example, there are Ukrainian language towns and Russian language towns nearby. So the education is now all in Ukrainian, and nobody controls what you speak on the street, at home, in the shop, etc. You can go.
Excuse me. You say it's all in Ukrainian or all in Russian?
Sorry?
You said the education in Lugansk is all in Ukrainian, or did you mean all in Russian?
No. I mean, on the Ukrainian-controlled part of Lugansk region and Donetsk region, the education is only in Ukrainian. On the separatist republics, only in Russian.
I see. And I mean, my impression is that there is some increased tension between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers, or an attempt to stir up some tension between them.
In Ukraine, there is no tension. I mean, there are people who are upset that there is no education in Russian, but this is a minority, and usually people who are retired and who have good memories of their youth in the Soviet Union. But this nostalgia is becoming less and less popular because of the politics of Russian Federation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Kyiv remains probably 65–70% Russian-speaking city. You can go to Russian drama theater and watch performances in Russian, it doesn't matter. But the education is in Ukrainian.
But you say that if somebody publishes a newspaper in Russian, that it also has to be in Ukrainian for instance, in Kiev.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have Ukrainian version of Russian language websites in Ukraine, or newspapers or magazines you publish. So you can publish in any language, but there should be a Ukrainian version of this.
I see. Okay, so would you have any further? Oh, yeah. One last question as far as the current situation, and you were commenting about the oligarchs fleeing the country, and I'm wondering if the situation with the oligarchs and the famed corruption and so on, what's the situation with that? What has been the situation with that over the last year or so?
Well, I mean, Zelensky, although I think he was helped by Kolomoisky to become a president, after that he started distancing himself from oligarchs.
Mm-hmm.
But there was no real fight. Maybe there is less influence now in the politics, but still the major oligarchs have their people in the parliament and they have their people in the ministries. So I think they still keep some kind of control over what is happening.
Okay. Any final words? Any message that you'd like to send to people here in the United States?
Well, I mean, I think many people abroad, they don't know the history of Ukraine, and they can not only receive false information about what is happening, but they can also misunderstand what is happening. So, I mean, I would advise everybody who is interested in Ukrainian affairs and in this conflict, have a look at a couple of books or websites to understand that Ukraine was independent territory for 300 years until 1654. And at that time, Ukraine had elections of the hetman, who was a military leader and head of the territory, whereas in Russia there was monarchy from the very beginning. So I mean, we have two different mentalities: mentality of people who used to choose who should run the country, and who always have their own opinion, and who would never accept one political party system or authoritarian regime. And Russian mentality of collective behavior and I mean, some kind of been accustomed to a monarchy, to one Tsar who should be the ruler of the country until his death. And actually, the collective mentality came to Ukraine not only with the Russian politics, but also with the Russian language. Russian language was the instrument to remove or to push aside Ukrainian individualistic mentality. I mean, Ukrainians were not ready to be collectivized in 1920s and 30s, and that's why actually Stalin deported 300,000 Ukrainian farmers to Siberia. So all these small things should be taken into account when somebody says that or repeats the words of Putin that Ukrainians and Russians are the same folk, the same people.
Made a meme here quoting the words of an unnamed Iranian. When they entered Afghanistan, they brought catastrophe for Afghans. And when they withdrew, they left calamity for Afghans. Biden announced that the United States is taking $7 billion of Afghan money that had been frozen in U.S. banks and was giving half of it to Americans who had won a lawsuit against the Taliban. This at a time when Afghans are in the winter and starving. We've pointed out in prior programs that the U.S. invaded in 2003 and took a country that was poor and turned it into a basket case that only survived via foreign donations. Eamon Moyheldin, an MSNBC opinion columnist, wrote, "Children are freezing, families are starving, millions of people need help. We've already caused irreparable damage to the people of Afghanistan with 20 years of a disastrous war that brought neither prosperity nor peace to the country. The Taliban are responsible for their fair share of the hell they have brought to the country. But one thing is clear, the Afghan people aren't responsible for 9/11, and they don't deserve the punishment of the U.S. taking their money."
One way to understand this segregation and oppression is to look at the ID system. Jewish Israelis have only one ID card, with a status that grants them the right to live almost anywhere they wish in the country. They can move freely with access to healthcare and vast resources. Palestinians, on the other hand, have 4 types of ID cards, if any at all. The kind of ID card you are given determines the level of rights you can enjoy and controls where you can go and what you can do. If you hold a green card, you are subject to military rule. And if you have a green card with a Gaza address, it means you're trapped in a 365-kilometre square open-air prison under Israeli military blockade in place since 2007. Israel controls what goes in and what goes out, from children's toys to medical supplies. 90% of the people have no access to safe drinking water, 47% are unemployed, 56% live in poverty. Palestinians with a Gaza ID are forbidden from going to Jerusalem in the West Bank, even if they have family there. Some people in the West Bank are considered to live there illegally and can be deported immediately to Gaza if found by the army, even if they have been in the West Bank for decades. Whereas, if you hold a green card which has a West Bank address, then you live here. This green card means you can live within specific enclaves surrounded by illegal Israeli settlements. And there's a separation wall and fences built around you since 2002, which Palestinians call the apartheid wall. It's 8 metres high in places and 700 kilometres long. That's twice the height of the Berlin Wall and more than 4 times its length. 80% of it is built inside the West Bank, occupying even more Palestinian land. There are separate roads for Israelis and Palestinians, hundreds of checkpoints scattered throughout, not to mention the 54 years of occupation which has devastated the lives of millions of Palestinians. Palestinians with a West Bank ID can travel to Gaza or East Jerusalem, but only if they receive a permit from the military to do so. This blue ID is for Palestinians in East Jerusalem. They can travel to the occupied West Bank as well as to Israel, but they are not citizens of Israel. They have only been granted a residency status. This means that they cannot vote in Israeli national elections, and if they leave East Jerusalem for too long, for example to study or work abroad or in other parts of the occupied West Bank, their residency is revoked, so they can't return. Since 1967, Israel has revoked the residency status of more than 14,600 Palestinians from East Jerusalem. Finally, Palestinian citizens of Israel. They have been through it all. They are the group that remained in Israel despite the ethnic cleansing in 1948. They lived under Israeli military rule that applied only to them and not Jewish Israelis for 18 years between 1948 and 1966. They were made citizens but can never become nationals and enjoy equality unless they become Jewish, which the law prohibits. They are the only Palestinians who can run and vote in Israeli elections, and they can move relatively freely, but the inequality against them was never dismantled, and they face daily institutional discrimination, including as members of parliament. And if this complex ID system wasn't enough to segregate the Palestinian community, in 2002, Israel introduced a law that prohibits family unification. That's right, denying Palestinians the right to live with their loved ones if their ID cards are different. And this woman is one of thousands of Palestinians who Israel will not issue any ID card.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.